guests. We are also pleased to have with us Ambassador Douglas Saunders, the Cabinet Secretary, along with Ms. Carol Palmer, the Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Energy, and members of the Petrol Jam Review Committee, the Chair, Mr. Zaka, along with his committee members, and of course the Chairman of Petrol Jam, Mr. Paul Ho. Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. We thank you once again, and now we invite the Prime Minister, the Most Honorable Andrew Holness, to make a statement.
Good afternoon, everyone. My task today is to set the context within which the Petrol Jam Review Committee, I say commission, is going to deliver their findings and the report itself. The first point of context is that Petrol Jam is a significant national asset. It is one of our largest public sector enterprise and has significant geopolitical importance and significant strategic importance for our energy security and indeed national development generally. Petrol Jam became the subject of national attention under controversial circumstances. The issue of the efficiency of the operation, the integrity of the institution, and indeed questions regarding public corruption. We cannot separate the issue of corruption in administration from the efficient operation of the enterprise, because indeed both things have an impact. When we were confronted as a government with these issues, we thought it best to once and for all address this issue, because any commentator on the issue who has an historical perspective would know that Petrol Jam throughout its history has always had episodes of grave public concern regarding the efficiency of its operations and indeed the integrity of its administration. But now we were faced with very serious decisions as to whether or not Petrol Jam could continue to operate as a going concern, as to whether or not Petrol Jam was viable to continue its operations. The government was also faced with decisions about making new investments in Petrol Jam and whether or not we should make those investments given all the changes that are happening both in terms of technology, in terms of market trends and demand, and of even greater importance of the geopolitics of the region. So if you place everything in context, changes in technology, changes in market condition, geopolitics, and then add on top of that issues of question regarding the administration and the efficiency of the business. The government therefore had some critical decisions to make. Now, in our democracy, we elect the executive to ultimately make decisions. But the executive is not always the best instrument to make the decisions, and it should never seek to make the decisions alone, especially when it comes to these very controversial issues. And I've always taken the view that when we have decisions of grave national importance, decisions about which there might be deeply held divisions in perspectives, that the executive should engage a process of consultation. And there is also important consideration that sometimes these national decisions get weighed down by political considerations. So, Petrol Jam is a public sector enterprise, but above everything else, it is a business. And therefore, you want to be able to ensure that you're making business decisions about these enterprises rather than having the political considerations weigh down on the business decisions. So, I thought it best that we assemble a team of eminent Jamaicans who understand business and who also have an understanding of the business of energy and the business of refineries, to give the government an unbiased perspective on our options. Not to tell us what to do, not to say this is what you must do, but to elucidate the challenges before us and to give the public a certain level of confidence that the decisions that we are going to make, that we have to make, are decisions that have had the benefit of the review, consideration, and analysis of the best minds available to Jamaica. And that these could truly be considered decisions that are made with the national interest, rather than a heavy weight of political consideration in them. So we assembled a team of highly respected Jamaicans, people who have done well in business, enterprise generally, and people who have served the government before and have experience in the capacity of giving advice. We don't have too many such persons, and we are always grateful when they decide to take time out of their business, because they're all well occupied, even those who are retired, and that they decide to give in service. I'm very humbled. You know, it's always a great trepidation that I write the names down and then pick up the phone to call, because I know it is a great imposition. But I also know that when I call, they're not going to say no unless it is. So I use it sparingly. But I'm very, very humbled and very happy that they have accepted. This is because, you know, this is the ultimate in contributing to your country, in giving of public service. And many would have felt a little bit concerned because the level of controversy surrounding the subject matter can be off-putting. And indeed, many who would want to contribute and serve would not want their name associated, because in today's world, you go on Google and something that you are only tangentially related to comes up. And not everybody is going to read a document. They just see your name and the controversial subject matter, and they draw a conclusion. So a lot of people who would want to give public service are just, you know, turned off by that. So there is, I think, a lesson as well, that as we grow and evolve in our democracy, that we also have to be a little bit more careful in how we cast aspersions and criticisms, though we must, and it's a very important part of the democracy. But I believe there is a greater level of sophistication that needs to be exercised when we do this, because the negative end of it is that we lose the interest of persons who would normally be very much willing to serve, but for fear that their name might be dragged through the mud. That is, something that we have to be concerned. But obviously, we have some brave persons who have decided to serve, and we are grateful. And I want to personally thank the chairman of the committee, Mr. Chris Zaka, who has a very substantial role in private life, but nonetheless decided to take this on. Chris, I'm very grateful. Thank you. Mr. Peter Moses, a legendary name in the financial sector in Jamaica for many years. Thank you, sir, for agreeing to serve on the committee. Mr. Paul Ho, another heavyweight in the business field in Jamaica, and the present chairman of the board of Petrol Jam. Thank you, sir, for giving up your time. Mr. Joe Matalan, another legendary name in many areas and continues to give in public service. Joe, of course, is the chairman of the OUR. Thank you, Joe, for serving. Mrs. Helen Davis White. Everybody knows Helen. I don't see her in the audience here today, but thank you, Helen. Mr. Dennis Cohen, another name in the financial sector. Mr. Norman Davis, and a well-known engineer in this area as well. Mr. Ike Johnson, another well-known name in the business sector. And Mr. Nicholas Scott, obviously for recent advertisements, another well-known name in the business sector, and Ms. Carleen O'Connor. I want to thank all of you for your service and for taking the time out to ensure that we have this roadmap. Some people would call it a decision tree, because effectively what it says is that these are your options. If you choose X, then logically these steps follow, and these consequences follow, and this could be the upside, and this could be the downside. And it's all nicely laid out. It's not for me to present the report. Today, the report, the findings and the options will be presented by the commission, and then the minister will make some comments, and I will merely be an observer when I close my presentation. So, ladies and gentlemen, I want to now turn over to the chairman of the commission.
Thank you, Prime Minister. And I'm going to ask the minister to.
Good afternoon, everyone. Most Honorable Prime Minister Andrew Holness, Board Chair and Board members of Petrol Jam and PCJ, members of the Review Committee, my very own PS, Mrs. Carol Palmer from the Ministry of Science, Energy and Technology, Acting General Manager from Petrol Jam, members of the media, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon again. I'll present a summary overview of the energy sector, which Petrol Jam operates in, and the changes propelling that sector, which I believe will give a context for any decisions to be made. The history of Petrol Jam, how it came to being, has been well chronicled. Since 1982, some 37 years now, Petrol Jam has loomed large in the Jamaican economy. It is a company that touches all our lives through the electricity that powers our homes, our businesses, and our street lights. Petrol Jam touches all our lives, whether we drive our own private cars, or motorbikes, or take public transportation. It touches our lives if we fly domestically or to foreign destinations. From the bauxite sector to the farmers who use tractors or small motorized equipment, it touches all our lives in multiple facets. And so the deliberations about this company, I know, will be carefully done, and hence the setting up of the review committee and the work that they have done. Ladies and gentlemen, we live with changes, and in the petroleum sector, we also live with volatility in international petroleum prices. Headlines in faraway countries affect us here in Jamaica. Just in recent weeks, headlines were attacks on tanker ships near the world's busiest sea lane for oil shipments send oil prices sharply higher, partially reversing a deep slump in crude futures. The attacks came against a backdrop of heightened tension between the US and Iran. Volatility in the energy sector has been impacting us for a long time, significantly. Back in 2009, the then administration sought to put Jamaica on a path to diversification in our fuel sources. The National Energy Policy was created to guide the sector. Through successive administrations, we charted the course, and by next year, 2020, our energy mix in the electricity sector will be even significantly more diversified, with 18% renewables, up from 15% in 2018, 37% natural gas, up from 11%, and 45% petroleum, down from 74%. In the transportation sector, we now have the opportunity to chart the policy for electric vehicles, giving consumers greater choices. Our movement along this pathway is to ensure our energy security by utilizing more of our indigenous resources, wind, solar, hydro, waste-to-energy, and to relentlessly push for continued downward movement in electricity prices for all Jamaicans. In the energy sector, rapid changes in technology are happening. Photovoltaic prices have fallen from approximately US $77 per watt in 1977 to nearly US 13 cents per watt in May 2019. And the experts point to even further improvements in the cost of solar energy. Utility-scaled renewables are being delivered here in Jamaica at prices we would not have thought possible even 5 years ago. It is not mind-blowing anymore to have conversations with experts in the energy sector about the path to 100% renewables in electricity generation. That, ladies and gentlemen, is where technology in the energy sector is trending. In land-based wind, experts say new construction wind power costs are compellingly below cost of continued use of existing coal-burning plants. In the US, as an example, wind power can be contracted via a power purchase agreement at 2 cents per kilowatt hour, while the operating costs for power generation in existing coal-burning plants remain above 3 cents. This is what economists call a disruptive technology, one that replaces an established technology and shakes up the industry. Additionally, the world is more environmentally conscious. Just these past 2 weeks, we here in Jamaica had a wake-up reminder of how climate change can disrupt our lives. We experienced a sizzling 39.1 degrees Celsius. For the older generation, 102.4 degrees Fahrenheit. The meteorologists could not find this in their records for Kingston. In other words, it was the highest ever recorded for Kingston. In the Warwicker Hills that run along Mountain View Avenue, we had spontaneous combustion, fires, a large fire that threatened the Long Mountain Country Club community. Just a few of the warning signs. Jamaica has commitment to do its part as a member of the global community to keep the global temperature rise to less than 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. This diversification in our energy mix will help us to meet that commitment. It is no secret that Petrol Jam will see local demand for heavy petroleum products decline. These changes will accelerate into 2020 and continue into 2030. Interestingly, in 2009, the Centennial Report noted that utilization rate at Petrol Jam was 72%, and it recommended that steps be taken to move to 87% utilization. Unfortunately, successive management at Petrol Jam paid scant regards to these recommendations. Utilization is now at about 63%, down from 72% in 2009. There is much work to be done. Now, with the PAC having indicated the completion of their inquiry into the Auditor General's report, I've asked the management through the board to lay out a plan to begin implementing all of the recommendations in the Auditor General's report with a focus on strict adherence to the procurement guidelines. The Ministry of Science, Energy and Technology has been taking steps to implement the recommendations from the Auditor General's report that are relevant to the ministry, the major one being greater oversight of Petrol Jam. The Auditor General found that MSET and parent company PCJ operated almost hands-off. This, since we've been there, has not and will no longer be the case going forward. The oversight will be deliberate and persistent. With that backdrop, I thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, Prime Minister, PS Minister. The Petrol Jam Review Committee was commissioned by the Cabinet in September of 2018. The Prime Minister has spoken to the membership, all very competent and eminent Jamaicans, and I want to thank them for being very supportive of me as chair, which was a great honor for me. I'd like to also make special mention of a few support team members. Mike Terrelong was the project manager. Sharon Northover was secretary, able secretary. And Sandra Wright and the Cabinet Office team who provided invaluable administrative and procedural support. A detailed description of the committee's terms of reference are contained in the report, but in general, the TOR required a thorough review of the petroleum industry dynamics, both locally and internationally. An examination of the existing product pricing approach and methodology used by Petrol Jam, and an assessment of its implications for the market, an examination of existing refinery upgrade plans, as well as possible alternatives in determining the strategic path forward in a national interest, as well as energy security considerations. We were also tasked to examine and make recommendations around the management, governance, and institutional arrangements under which Petrol Jam operates. And finally, a catch-all that required that we examine, quote, any other factors thought to be critical to the proper functioning and growth of Petrol Jam. The committee started working immediately, and we had consultations with a wide range of stakeholders, including the general manager and other members of Petrol Jam's senior management team, the executive of the Jamaica Gasoline Retailers Association, the CEO and Senior VP Generation of the Jamaica Public Service Company, the JPS, the CEOs of Total Jamaica, Rubis Energy Jamaica, and GB Texaco Jamaica, the CEO and management of the Petro Carib Fund, union representation from UKs and union delegates from Petrol Jam, and of course, the Minister with responsibility for Energy, Honorable David Williams. The committee determined that in order to fulfill its terms of reference, we needed to procure an international petroleum industry expert in order to complete the necessary detailed technical and financial analysis. And an RFP was issued in accordance with GOJ procurement guidelines, and ultimately the firm Gaffney Klein and Associates was contracted for the purpose and conducted their work in the period January 22nd through April 22nd, 2019. The committee handed its report time on May 31st, 2019 to the Cabinet, and Cabinet has considered or heard from us, the committee, and interrogated our report. I want to now hand over to the OUR and member of the committee, Joseph Matalon, for a presentation of the main findings of our report, and then I will come back and deliver the main recommendations. Joe?
Thank you, Chairman Chris, Mr. Prime Minister, Minister Williams, Permanent Secretary, Cabinet Secretary Saunders, anybody else that I missed. Good afternoon. The committee's report contains a quite detailed account of our analysis and deliberations, which it is not my intention to simply regurgitate here. I'm going to attempt instead a brief summary of the more material findings and conclusions of the committee before handing back to Chairman Zaka to take us through the committee's ultimate and final recommendations. In terms of our examination of the historical financial performance of Petrol Jam, and in that context, their pricing methodologies, which was one of the key requirements under the TOR, the consultants' analysis of Petrol Jam's historical financials included the creation of pro forma financial statements for the period 2014 through 2018, with a clear separation, not available in the published accounts, between the results of refinery operations and separately the terminal operations, that is, the storage and subsequent distribution of finished products. These analyses produce several pertinent findings as to the company's sources of margin generation. And these included, for example, during the reference period, the company having enjoyed an average annual margin amounting to approximately US $26 million a year, arising from the differential lower rates of customs administration fees, otherwise known as CAF, applied to crude oil imports versus the rate of CAF applied to imported finished products. Secondly, the terminal rack and storage fees contributed approximately $45 million on average annually to margins. The consultants determined that certain other price adjustments also contributed to approximately $52 million per year on average annually to the company's margins. While the consultants were made privy to the nature of the various categories of other price adjustments and were able to determine their aggregate value at US $52 million as above, they were not able to ascribe a value to each category of such adjustment because Petrol Jam does not track the impact of these individual adjustments in their base accounting systems. Neither does Petrol Jam include such adjustments in their forward planning and budgeting processes. The consultants also produced similar pro forma statements which eliminated the US $52 million of other price adjustments, but maintained the terminal fees and the CAF margin in the refinery. The results of the analysis on this basis reflected a loss in the refinery cumulative over the reference period of US $55 million, compared to profits generated in the terminal equivalent to approximately $105 million US dollars. Had the CAF margin been eliminated, the refinery's position would have been substantially worsened over the reference period. It is very important to note, therefore, that the maintenance of the CAF margin and the CAF differential is a critical factor in the viability of the refinery in any future operating scenario. Although not strictly within the committee's mandate, Gaffney Klein also examined pricing in the supply chain from the point of the refinery to the retail pump, and observed that the combined distribution and retail margins earned in Jamaica are 2 to 7 times higher than those observed in developed markets such as the USA. The committee concluded that there may be several different factors contributing to this differential, and as such, that further studies would be required to quantify their impact and assess whether any policy intervention might be warranted. In terms of the operating performance or efficiency of the Petrol Jam operation, the consultants provided two, I think, significant findings in their review of the historical refinery operations, which are worth highlighting. The first is that the refinery's average capacity utilization over the reference period, as the minister pointed out in her presentation, was only 63%. Very low by international standards and by reference to the targets suggested in the Centennial Report, which would suggest a target utilization rate closer to 80% or above, and placing, as a result, a considerable drag on the company's financial performance. The consultant also observed that Petrojam's operating expenses, expressed in US dollars per barrel of product processed, were significantly higher than both regional and international benchmarks. So in response to the minister's statement in relation to there being a lot of work to be done in order to establish an efficient refining operation, I think those two statistics are very relevant. The minister has talked about the market changes, and the committee identified a few critical issues that are expected to impact the operations of Petrol Jam. The minister has referred to the imminent shift in feedstocks used by the local power generating sector from heavy fuel oil or high sulfur fuel oil supplied by Petrol Jam and towards liquid natural gas, with 190 megawatt of such capacity to be commissioned into service at the beginning of August of this year, and a further 94 megawatt to be commissioned into service in 2020-2021. This reality, as the minister has stated, will see a reduction of approximately 2/3 in the local market for HFO over the next 2 or 3 years, with severe adverse impact on Petrojam's existing revenue base. On the international front, revised international regulations to become effective in January 2020 will mean that the specifications for bunker fuel will be at a new, higher standard that Petrojam is not currently equipped to produce, further reducing sources of demand for the high sulfur fuel oil currently produced by the company. Finally, the consultants noted the relatively less stringent regulatory framework for petroleum products as it exists in Jamaica. It is expected that environmental protection considerations in Jamaica will increase to meet international best practices in refineries over time, and as such, capital provisions for environmental improvements to the refinery need to be made for any future operation of that company. Gaffney Klein has estimated approximately US $236 million in additional capex that will eventually be required to adjust these quality environmental issues. And this expenditure was included in the relevant financial models provided to the committee in respect of future strategic options which we were then considering. Turning now to the future strategic options identified by the consultants and endorsed by the committee. The consultants ran financial models for the Petrol Jam proposed vacuum distillation unit, VDU, and the larger refinery upgrade program, all of which produced negative returns on investment. The consultant identified a short-term opportunity involving minimal investment to convert the refinery to sweet crude feedstocks in order to produce finished products with lower sulfur content to meet the demand for bunker fuel as well as low sulfur diesel oil, which are anticipated to be in high demand at attractive prices for the next 2 to 3 years. For the medium to longer term, the consultants also identified an economically viable scenario for continued refinery operations involving capital expenditure of approximately US $70 million to allow the refinery to process extra light crudes in order to produce lower sulfur fuels as well as more higher margined gasoline fuels. It is important to note again that while such a viable scenario was identified for the continued operations of the refinery, such an operating model would nevertheless only be viable so long as GOJ maintains its current policy stance on the CAF differential. Finally, the consultants identified an economically viable scenario in which the refinery ceases to operate altogether, with the existing storage infrastructure retained, but now dedicated exclusively to terminal operations. In this scenario, all finished product demand would be satisfied by imports. The committee concluded, based upon the consultants' advice, that the closure of the refinery would not lead to any elevation of risk to the country in terms of energy security, which would be adequately secured by the existence of the significant storage capacity infrastructure and standalone terminal operations. Importantly, this scenario would also involve a significant increase in GOJ revenues, given that the higher rates of CAF would now be applied to a much larger proportion of total energy imports. That represents the main findings of the committee. I want to take the opportunity, since Chris has been so gracious as to thank the other members of the committee, to on their behalf thank him for his leadership and perspicacity as we worked to get this thing completed. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Before I present the recommendations of the committee, which were unanimously adopted by the committee, I want to speak about the role of the Planning Institute in the work of the committee, in that we did engage the Planning Institute to look at the implications in terms of national development, the economy, GDP, etc., of some of the options that were presented by the consultants. And they did a fantastic job for us in a very short time. And one of their estimates based on historical and projected demand and production data provided suggests that the GDP would be highest under the extra light crude investment case for the period 2020 through to 2039. And we did take that very carefully into account, that the existence of a viable refinery does add to the GDP, provides employment at both very skilled and also at base levels of employment. So we did have to take that into consideration. So I'll go to the recommendations. And as the Prime Minister said, these are simply recommendations, and a detailed reading of the report will show that there are, as the PM said, there is a decision tree. There are various decisions that have to be made in policy, and those will flow through to final decisions. But I will say that the committee's analysis demonstrates that for the Petrol Jam refinery to become commercially viable, its operating efficiencies must improve, the CAF fiscal regime must be maintained, and an investment, which we call the extra light scenario, of approximately US $78 million must be made. In light of that overarching view, the committee makes the following recommendations. We are of the view that transfer of active management of the refinery and terminal to the private sector provides the only credible opportunity to improve the operating performance of both entities, while also mitigating the operating and project execution risks to the government and people of Jamaica. Irrespective of the government's policy decision to maintain the CAF margin or otherwise, the PRC, our committee, therefore recommends that the government exit active management of both the terminal and the refinery through a long-term lease of Petrol Jam's underlying assets. 2, the PRC recommends that the GOJ commissions a petroleum industry enterprise team to chart a course for the government's exit from the operational management of Petrol Jam. The enterprise team should, in our view, also engage a suitable transaction advisor, such as the International Finance Corporation, the IFC, an arm of the World Bank, to assist in identifying a suitable lessor with an appropriate PPP transaction framework. If the transaction advisors are unable in their investigations and analysis of the market to determine sufficient interest in the option to lease, then the refinery, in our view, should be shut down and a terminal-only operation should be implemented. Our observation of other similar transactions, such as the Norman Manley and Sangster Airport concessions, suggests that such an effort will not happen overnight and can only be accomplished over a period of around 2 years. We therefore make the following subsidiary recommendations for consideration and implementation by Petrol Jam and the government during or as a part of the divestment process. First of all, the committee does not recommend that Petrol Jam continues to pursue the vacuum distillation unit project or the refinery upgrade projects. On pricing, we have several recommendations stemming from the findings of the consultant about other price adjustments over the 4-year period between 2014 to 2018. First of all, we feel that with the exception of price adjustments related to the terminal fees, rack fees, and the CAF margin, no other price adjustments should be applied by Petrol Jam without the oversight of an independent authority. We feel that Petrol Jam should, with immediate effect, begin reporting the impact of all price adjustments separately on its financials and keeping track of such adjustments above the pricing that is allowed by the CIF model. And that would allow a better understanding of the contribution of these adjustments and facilitate the ongoing management and reporting of their impact. 3, that GOJ should immediately begin the process of establishing an appropriate regulatory framework for the petroleum industry, including oversight with a maximum price at the terminal rack that incorporates CIF costs, terminal fees, and taxes, but restricts or eliminates the use of other adjustments which are to be approved only by the nominated regulator. And regulations should also require that all terminals operating in Jamaica, not just Petrol Jam, be obliged to post prices at the exact same time. We feel that will improve competition. Pending the legislation and implementation of a revised regulatory framework, we feel that in the interim, the government should appoint an independent expert to the current pricing committee at Petrol Jam, and that this independent expert should be mandated to ensure that the prices posted by Petrol Jam adhere to the government's new pricing policy. Also, as a part of the regulatory process, the Ministry of Energy should examine opportunities for increasing the number of marketing companies and instituting other measures to increase competition in the distribution and retail value chain ex-Petrol Jam's terminal gate. In terms of operating efficiencies, Petrol Jam, in our view, should make every effort in the short run to enter into commercial and operating arrangements to maximize the processing of sweet crudes, to reduce the production of heavy fuel oil, high sulfur fuel oil, and increase the production and sale of more marketable low sulfur fuel oil and low sulfur products. That is the sweet operating scenario which Joe spoke of as a 2 to 3 year operating window, which allows some breathing room while the other decisions and implementations are taking place. However, further detailed feasibility studies need to be conducted as a part of the efforts of the enterprise team to include a detailed engineering design which would determine the process plant improvements required for the refinery to enable processing extra light crudes such as those that are available for export from the United States of America. Such a study would clarify in greater detail the investments required and schedule for the refinery modifications, as well as the yields that could be obtained by the refinery for various products. We also feel that Petrol Jam's management must be tasked to undertake a major cost reduction effort with a targeted 20% reduction in current operating costs at the refinery. And as a part of that, they must implement an operations management program and define with refinery consultant Solomon Associates, who have provided a report to the refinery, the potential improvement in the operation that can be achieved and prepare a defined work plan to achieve such improvements. These improvements should be closely monitored at the board level and play an important role in overall management of performance for the organization. The final recommendation is around governance, and on reviewing the Auditor General's report, the committee were impressed with the depth of that report. I did not feel that it was of any value for us to further examine the governance arrangements or the governance deficiencies at Petrol Jam, and guided by the Auditor General's report, we felt that what has happened at Petrol Jam is a breakdown of governance, that all the rules and regulations are in place, that the public management regulations are fully sufficient, and that the governance of Petrol Jam, led by their board, which was a joint board between the government of Jamaica and the Venezuelan PDVSA, just was not working and had fallen down. And our final recommendation, therefore, is that a fully functioning board for Petrol Jam needs to be appointed as soon as possible with an appropriate mix of private and public sector individuals with the requisite skills. And the board should have in its composition or as an advisor export petroleum industry advice and perspective independent of the company's management. So ladies and gentlemen, that completes the committee's recommendations. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Zaka. So to Mr. Matalon and, of course, the Minister Favour Williams, the Honourable Favour Williams, and the Prime Minister, the Most Honourable Andrew Holness. And now, ladies and gentlemen, members of the media will take some questions. We have a microphone in the audience. We ask that you raise your hand if you have any questions. If you do, then we ask you to identify yourself and your media entity and ask your question. Are there any questions? Toward the back. Yes, go ahead, please. Go ahead.
Petrol Jam or to either lease Petrol Jam to the private sector or to undertake a terminal-only operation, what would be the impact on the actual jobs at the refinery?
If a suitable private sector lessee who has clearly expertise in refinery operations is identified, we see a positive impact on jobs at the refinery in the long run, and improved efficiencies, improved technology will mean continued economic development, including jobs. So we don't see any impact there. Where there would be an impact is if that process is not successful and the refinery would be shut down and placed in a terminal-only operation. Clearly that would have an impact. But we are confident and optimistic that a suitable lessee will be identified in the next 2 years.
Thank you so much, Mr. Zaka. Any other questions from members of the media? A question at the back here.
Good afternoon, Mr. Zaka, Prime Minister, Minister. Two questions. Mr. Zaka, can you indicate on what, Liver and Barrett, and I'm from the Gleaner Company. Can you indicate on what would form the basis of the recommendation you made for the refinery and for the transfer to the private sector of Petrol Jam? That's one. And Prime Minister, can you indicate if Cabinet has, after considering the report, is likely to accept any of the recommendations that were made in the report?
Go ahead.
Repeat the question for me, please. Because I was worried for the Prime Minister, you see.
Made the recommendation.
Yeah, so the introductory paragraph to our recommendations speaks to what we see as must-dos, and one of those is to operate at a very high utilization of well over 80%. We feel that a government-run organization, and as the PM said, which is not impervious or totally isolated from political decision-making, would have difficulty doing that. And I think that's the basis of our view that a private sector-run, highly efficient refinery, given the small size of Petrol Jam, the small size of the market, etc., would be the only viable alternative?
I earlier explained the process that I engaged through the Cabinet Office to come to a better understanding of what the government needs to do. And the reason why I did it is because Petrol Jam is such a political flashpoint that it could be subject to weighty political considerations rather than the business consideration. We oftentimes tend to forget in the public conversation that Petrol Jam, more than anything else, is a business. And so we wanted to get a better understanding of the cold, hard facts as it relates to the operational efficiency and the business decisions that need to be taken. To the average man, the business decisions can sound scary, such as mothball the plant and just operate a terminal. And then the legitimate question, so what happens to the jobs and the people who are there? And it is the duty of the government to, even though these decisions may sound scary, to walk the public through it and to ensure that if there are to be changes, then no one comes out as a loser in the process of change. And so the report isn't only saying this is what we recommend, the report gives alternatives. Here are the things you can do. If you choose to keep the refinery open, then you have to keep the custom administration fee in place. What's the impact of that economically? Because ultimately it's the consumer that pays the CAF to keep the refinery going, to keep people employed. Could that mass of resources be redistributed in some way to generate the same jobs more efficiently without being a burden on the consumer? But the consumer is saying, I'm going to lose jobs. But because the CAF is so small to the average consumer, they might not see the impact when it is aggregated. But that's why you have a government, to see whether or not there are marginal changes and improvements that can be made to lift overall welfare. I feel that we have been given a clear decision tree by the review committee, and it is now for the cabinet. But remember I said earlier, ultimately the executive, the cabinet makes the decisions. But the process of making the decision should not always be that the cabinet sits in the cabinet office and makes the decision alone. That when it comes to such a politically sensitive public enterprise like Petrol Jam, it's important to get the pure business decision, the pure business perspective, and then we go to Parliament. So the report, the next phase, Laverne, is that this report will be tabled in Parliament. And then we will have reserved parliamentary time for it to be debated. And of course, I'm always listening to what the public is going to say. The report will be made public, and the stakeholders, even though many of them would have had the opportunity to speak to the committee, might want to go public with their views as well. And then we gauge public opinion, engage the public in this conversation, and we make a decision. This is not an unbounded period of engagement. We have some critical timelines on these things because the refinery is now not operating at its fullest. When JPS decides to switch on their plant, immediately their supply, the need for HFO from Petrol Jam will be cut. They will lose a significant part of their custom, and that will tighten the decision-making timeline for us. So we will allow for a period of public discourse. Then the cabinet will consider the ventilated matter, and we will come to a decision. We have considered the report, but we have not come to any conclusions just yet.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. A question at the back here.
Good afternoon, Vanessa Silvera, JIS News. 2 questions. When exactly will the report be made public, please? And secondly, what are some of the requirements that a potential lessee would need to meet to be deemed suitable? Mr. Zaka.
You could take the second one, I'll take the first. which is the report is technically public now as of this press conference. We have briefed the stakeholders, particularly Petrol Jam board and staff. They have been briefed. It will be tabled in Parliament. If you, CabSec, will we put it on our cabinet website, OPM website? So it will be there, the public can pull it down. It will be tabled in Parliament next week, Tuesday. So the report is effectively public.
Mr. Zaka?
And on the ministry's website as well.
So, a potential lessee of Petrol Jam's assets would simply three conditions. One, expertise in refining operations. Two, money, because they would be tasked to implement an upgrade of the technology to process the extra light crudes out of the US. And thirdly, integrity and due diligence on the quality of the shareholdings and management of such a lessee.
Thank you so much. Are there any other questions? Well, ladies and gentlemen, we thank you for coming this afternoon. Have a good afternoon, everyone.